All right. It is 1 o'clock, and hello to everyone out there. Welcome to BlackHorse Solutions presentation of the Safe Traveler information. My name is Rick Dawson, and I'll be talking today about basic computer security, threats to your privacy and security, and the things that you can do about them. So, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'm being assisted by Gabriella today, and she will be checking with me periodically. Let me know what questions we have out there. Also, keep in mind that there's a little bit of a delay between when you type in a question and when I see it. So don't worry, I will definitely get to you if you've got a question out there. Awesome. So let's move on right along. What is safety and security when you're talking about browsing the internet or just being online in general? Right? Good question. So, we use the terms privacy and security more or less interchangeably in most conversations, but I think it's worth starting out this discussion with a look at what is privacy and what is security, and how do those things relate to you as a user, right? So let's take a look. So security in this context, if you think about it, is how your personal information is protected, right? Is it encrypted? Is it traveling in an encrypted format over HTTPS? Is it stored securely in a database or other medium? And that's really something that can be defined by both industry and the government. Industry has their best practices, and the government standards are, at least in the United States, put out by the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, which makes a lot of sense. So security measures are really solid, tangible items that you can really point out and say, "Hey, this is being done at this time. This is how we are protecting our information." Right? It's basic data security. It's about securing the data itself. Privacy, on the other hand, is your right to control how your personal information is exposed and how it's used. And because each of us has sort of a different sense of what should be private and what shouldn't be, really, privacy when it comes down to it, is defined by each individual user or each individual person out there. For example, do you care that other people know your birth date? Or is that something you feel is really fun to share on social media so that you get a lot of, happy birthdays or whatever? That's a decision only you can make. We could say, well, that could be used to potentially compromise your identity. But then on the other hand, you could also say, realistically, that information is publicly available out there in a lot of different measures for anyone who knows how to look for it and has the desire to look for it. So is that something you would really want to control? And that really comes down to you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So maybe to clarify the difference between privacy and security, let's take an example, right? So we have a personal bank account, right? You go in, you open up an account, and you have all of your related information, your bank account number, routing, the balance, of course, and all of those things, right? You count on the bank to protect your information, social security number, etc., and provide you with various products and services. So the bank is in charge of protecting that data. And as we just talked about, those standards are defined by the banking industry and by the U.S. government and other governments overseas as well. So how do these things become compromised? Well, imagine in the privacy context, the bank decides to sell some of your information to a marketer or to a business partner so that they can market other products to you, perhaps other banking products, perhaps credit cards, that sort of thing. So has your, at least hopefully, has your security been compromised? No. Let's assume that that banking partner adheres to the same government and industry standards that are prescribed for everyone, right? So presumably your security was not compromised, but your privacy may have been. Perhaps you don't want your information being used for marketing purposes. And that, of course, comes down to your bank's privacy disclosure. But in that sense, your security is maintained, the security of your information, and your privacy is potentially compromised. Of course, on the farther end of the spectrum, you have the potential to have both your security and your privacy compromised if, for example, the bank was penetrated by a cyber criminal and resulted in a data breach, right? So if these criminals got a hold of the bank's information, yours and presumably a number of other people's, then they could use that information. They could sell it. They could use it for identity theft, fraudulent credit cards, etc. So in that case, both your privacy and the security of that information have been compromised. And there you have it. So there's kind of a difference between privacy and security that maybe that example can draw out a little bit. And it's worth thinking about because when you decide what it is that you need to protect and who it is that you need to protect it from, and who it is that you're going to trust having that information, you have to consider things like the bank. Do you trust that bank with your information? Do they have a history of poor security practices that have resulted in things like breaches? Or, conversely, when you're talking about something online, do you trust that cryptocurrency exchange with your credit card and banking information? It's a worthy question, especially in these days of flying Dogecoin. So something to consider. All right. Something else to consider. So let's talk about those threats, right? There's been a lot of talk of breaches in the news. It would be hard to imagine that someone hadn't heard about ransomware and the Colonial Pipeline. It would be hard to imagine that someone hadn't heard about the water treatment facility in Florida where a hacker was able to access the facility using a remote system and then actually change the chemical composition of that water, potentially endangering everyone who is a customer of that, right? Of that water system. So these sort of things have been in the news, but there's been a lot of different talk about what these threats actually are. So let's go through a couple of them and talk about how these things are accomplished and the ones that will apply primarily to the safe traveler concept, right? Okay, so let's start out with phishing. Everyone's probably heard about phishing, right? It's even entirely likely that you get phishing training at your place of work, you get phishing training maybe at school, and pretty much every basic cybersecurity program has some sort of educational system or educational program regarding phishing, right? So phishing is basically an attempt to obtain sensitive information like a username, passwords, or really anything by impersonating some sort of trustworthy entity, usually using electronic means. And I'm being super vague in this. Phishing more often than not refers to using email, but there are a lot of subsets of phishing. Vishing, which is voice phishing, smishing, which is SMS phishing, And all of us have gotten, probably at one time or another, a phone call, perhaps telling you that the IRS has just looked at your taxes and you must call this number immediately. And if you pay them X amount of money, then the whole problem will go away. Otherwise, they're sending the police to your house to arrest you right now. Or a text message saying that you've won something. Or the ever ubiquitous Nigerian prince email saying that there's someone in a country like Nigeria who needs to move a large amount of money. They have somehow found you on the internet, and if you could only send them your bank account information, perhaps they would share some of their wealth with you when they leave the country. All of these are phishing attempts designed to pull information out of you. In the last case, of course, your bank account information. But in other cases, other things to include wire transfers. So phishing is just a means of impersonating someone or something that may be important to you, and also that would pull personal information that could be used by the attacker, right? You'll also hear a couple other terms related to phishing if you're, and perhaps you've heard some of these, right? So spear phishing. So spear phishing is a much more targeted attack. In the case of the Nigerian prince scam, the common one, it's a pretty general email. Also, not particularly credible. Usually, there are typos, and just the thought that someone in a random country wants to send a couple $1 million to your bank account seems a bit far-fetched. Spear phishing, on the other hand, sounds a lot more reasonable. If, for example, someone got a list of customers of Bank of America, sorry, Bank of America, not to pick on you, but if someone got a list of customers of Bank of America and then took a Bank of America looking email, used your name in the email and said, hey, we think that there's been a password breach, we don't think your information has been compromised, however, we're recommending that all users change their password in the next 24 to 48 hours, please click this link. Well, that sounds like a legit email. It might actually happen. However, double check that link, because there's a definite chance that that's a phishing email, right? Whaling is similar, but whaling is targeted to an upper manager based on a company's role. So whaling is to try to take down an executive with some kind of major issue and get their credentials or whatever information that the fisherman's looking for, right? And usually they're disguised as critical business emails. I don't know how many of us have gotten those. I'm certainly not that important. And then there's farming. Farming is beginning to cross into the man-in-the-middle attacks. It's kind of a two-step process. So whereas phishing, the goal is for you to click on a link, and that takes you to a website or some other site that masquerades as a legitimate site, Bank of America in our example. Farming includes the first primary step of changing your address request to send you to a malicious website. For example, we'll just stick with the banking industry, right? So you go to log into your bank, you type mybank.com like you always do, and expect to go to your bank. However, the attacker has changed the address in the domain name service, which we'll talk about, and it has actually sent you to their fake website, which looks very much like your normal bank, yourbank.com, and you end up entering your credentials. Now if their website is any good, will probably forward you on to your actual bank after capturing your credentials, and they'll be using those in the future. So that becomes sort of a man-in-the-middle attack, right? Which is just anyone who gets in between your intended receiver or whoever you're intending to communicate with and you. And that's a man-in-the-middle attack. In all the different incarnations of it, that's really what you need to know. You've also probably heard of denial of service attacks. So these attacks generally don't result in the compromise of any of your information. And they're usually directed at companies and not at individuals. What happens in super once over the world is that an attacker will overload a particular website and that if you try to go to that website during that time period, it simply can't service your request. It can't respond to you in amongst all the noise that it's getting from an attacker. And while that's annoying, it usually doesn't result in a loss of data, especially in the modern world. 10 years ago, maybe, but not anymore. So you'll hear about it. Denial of service attacks are very superficial, however, and probably, except in very unusual circumstances, won't apply to you as an individual. What will apply to you as an individual is called cross-site scripting. It's similar to a man-in-the-middle attack, but instead of taking you to an entirely different website or a spoofed website, someone has inserted malicious code into something like an ad that runs inside your browser. So while you are actually legitimately on the site you intend to be on, you're actually getting malicious traffic through one of the ads or one of the other elements of that page. And we'll talk about browsers in a bit. But keep in mind that a browser is essentially processing information and then showing it to you. What you see in a browser is only a portion of what that browser is actually getting from the web server. So something else that happens, all of these examples have been types of password attacks, or at least can be, right? The desire or attempt to compromise your password by collecting information on you. So we'll talk about passwords, which have become a really, really important element of protecting your information. And then I'll take two more other categories here and real quickly explain them. Ransomware, and again, in the news, especially if you lived in the Northeast, recently the Colonial Pipeline was attacked by ransomware, and it resulted in them shutting down a major petroleum pipeline on the East Coast. So that is ransomware. Essentially, someone comes in, it breaches a computer system, and then either encrypts or in other ways holds that system hostage until someone pays them X amount of, usually Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. But they're doing it for payment. It literally is holding someone else's system for ransom. And I want to compare that with eavesdropping attacks, which usually have the same initial attack when they get into a system, but the attacker, instead of locking the system up, just lurks in the system and collects things like passwords, emails, etc. This is kind of your classic hack, and pulls a lot of either corporate information or personal information if they're conducting this against an individual. And a lot of times, both ransomware and eavesdropping attacks are attacks of opportunity. An attacker has cast a wide net looking for vulnerable systems. A system here or there demonstrates a vulnerability. Then the attacker goes after that vulnerability, and it's off to the races. So those are some basic threats that are out there. And the question is, what can you do about it? All right. So number one, let's talk about some basic computer security. So there are a lot of things that you can do to make yourself less of a vulnerable target. Remember, I just said attackers are casting a wide net. They're scanning the networks, looking for a computer that has a vulnerability. So for the most part, if you don't have a vulnerability, the attacker would skip by your system and go to someone else. It kind of goes with that old saying, you don't have to be able to outrun the bear, you just have to be able to outrun your friends. Right? So one of the first and initial ways to harden your system, and one of the ones that we find most frequently, is user account control and the principle of least privilege. So user account control is the ability for a particular account on a computer, your user account, to do certain things within that operating system. And this applies to all operating systems, although it's implemented in very different ways, across Windows, Mac OS, the various flavors of Linux. They all have a way of addressing this. So let's talk about what user account control is. All right. So the idea is that on a day-to-day basis, you need to do only certain things on your computer system, right? Perhaps for the most part, you just surf the web, or you use an office suite to, put together lesson plans to put on YouTube, things like that. So for the most part, in doing that, there's no reason to have access to what we call the kernel level services, that's KERNEL, that are used by the operating system to do things like write, save, delete files, or format the operating system, an operating system drive, or create custom packages to send out to other computers, and that sort of thing. Most of those things are handled by programs, which are an interface between the user and the operating system. So the application layer handles that. So most users don't require an administrator account for day-to-day operations, right? During an attack process, when we're talking about a system being breached, what we normally see is that a user or an attacker will attempt to get into a system through a vulnerability. All right, number one, try to minimize vulnerabilities. Number two, if that penetration is successful, the next thing that the attacker will need to do is see what level of privilege he or she has on that system. And what primarily determines that is the account that was breached. So if I took my Windows computer out of the box, fired it up for the first time, went through the initial sign-in process, created an account, all of those things, that initial account is a privileged account. I essentially have administrator access, which, from a user experience point of view, does make a certain degree of sense, because I may need to, the next thing I do after I unpack my brand new system is possibly install software and things like that. Microsoft has made it very easy for me to do that by making me an administrator. Also, there's going to have to be at least one administrator, so you might as well create it right up front. The thing is that in doing that, most people don't realize that the overall intent is to subsequently create a lower privileged user, because all the things you see listed here are available to an admin user, and a lot of these are potential points of pain if an attacker gets into this admin account, right? I mean, as an administrator or that first run user, you have access to all the other data that any other user puts on that system. You can do things like causing code to run when anyone logs on, and depending on how that plays out in different operating systems, there are different ways to do that. You can even disable the antivirus, which is a common tactic for malware once it infects your system. It also enables that person to cover their tracks in an event log. They could delete any evidence that they had been in there. Yes, there would still be a blank spot, but it worked for President Nixon, so off we go. All right, so the initial portion of computer hardening is to take that administrative user account and create a second account that you will use for your daily driver. All right, the daily driver account is what we would call a standard user account. So in the Windows family, at least since Windows 7, and hopefully no one's using anything older than that at this point, you have an administrator account or a standard user account. As soon as you have done your initial configuration, maybe you've loaded, and this is speaking about a Windows computer specifically, perhaps you've loaded Microsoft Office, perhaps you've put in your Adobe suite, whatever it is that you need to install on that system. Use the administrator account, that's what it's for, but then create a second standard user and switch over to using that for just about every other activity. You'll notice that there are a couple messages that Windows will pop up for you if you are in an administrator account versus a standard user account. Now, for those of you who haven't done this, keep in mind that the standard user account can still be used to install software, but it will require you to type the administrator account username and password rather than just clicking yes. Let's take this back to the prevention of a breach or prevention of damage spreading from a breach. You can see how even if your standard user account was compromised by something like a man-in-the-middle attack or something like that, then even if they wanted to elevate privileges to spread to another portion of your network or to do something more malicious on your system, they would have to know also your administrator and username and password. So that, indeed, will help protect against that. In the Mac operating system, you have a very similar setup. You've got the administrator account and a standard user account. You've also got, in the Mac system, you've got the gatekeeper setting, which will prevent unsigned code from being executed. What is unsigned code? Well, when software developers build a piece of software, they and then put it in an app store, they sign it digitally. This does two things. One, it allows you to verify that the software you're getting, let's say Adobe Acrobat, that Adobe Acrobat is in fact the one that Adobe put out. It has their digital signature. That digital signature also contains elements that give you a hash value of the software when it was signed. What this does is it allows you to check to see if that software has somehow been manipulated by some sort of virus or other malware, and then that would cause it to be invalid, right? And so the gatekeeper setting checks those signatures and validates that this is, in fact, your Adobe Acrobat, and that it has not, according to the signature, been altered since it was signed, which gives you a fair degree of assurance that this is legitimate software that you intend to run. In the Linux ecosystem, you have what's called the root user. And it works a little bit differently, but it is conceptually the same sort of administrator account that you would call administrator in either Windows or Mac. Each standard user can be given a certain set of privileges, one of which is called sudo or super user do. It allows a standard user to run as an administrator for a period of time to install software and that sort of thing. It is definitely not recommended in Linux, in any version of it, to run as the root user. The root user has essentially unlimited privilege on any system, and anyone hacking into a Linux root account has basically complete control of that system. If you're familiar with Linux, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, then it's something fun that you can pull out at a cocktail party and have a conversation about. So, we've gone in, we've set up our standard user so that we know that we've now made ourselves more difficult should an attacker get in. So, we talked about vulnerabilities, or I mentioned vulnerabilities. So, what sort of vulnerabilities might you find if you were attacking a system? Well, frequently, software. It's a software bug, and a bug is just a piece of code that doesn't operate quite as expected, or operates in an unexpected way, given conditions that weren't anticipated when the software was written. Bugs happen all the time, and the more complex software is, the more opportunities there are for there to be a bug in that. So, to keep bugs and other vulnerabilities to a minimum, we need to make sure that we do operating system, which is basically just another piece of software, and application updates, right? So how does this happen? How do we do that, right? So luckily, all of the major operating system types have their own update system, right? Microsoft has Microsoft updates, of course, and usually they push out their big updates once a month on the second Tuesday, which everyone is affectionately taken to referring to as Patch Tuesday. Is it perfect? No, not really. Patch Tuesday is often followed by Frustration Wednesday, where something didn't go quite as expected. But I think we can give Microsoft a small break when we realize that they have to deal with hardware that could be any age. It might be new, it might be old. People have configured it in various ways, and some of those things are just unexpected. So while the Microsoft patch system isn't perfect, it's still a good idea to do it. And Microsoft has gotten better. If they know that there's an issue, they usually test these applications. You have to get a little bit more hands-on. And when we talk about applications in general, I can't help but bring up Brian Krebs, because he's a really smart guy. And he's been a security blogger for a long time. Look for Krebs on Security, quick plug. But he's got 3 general rules, right? So when it comes to applications and software on your system, if you didn't go looking for it, don't install it. When does this happen? Well, imagine you're on a website and you want to check out the latest video from your favorite artist, and when you click on it, a little box pops up and says, hey, to watch this video, you have to install our video player software. So my question is, if you could play videos on your system prior to installing that software, why would you want to install software based on this little pop-up box? And that's where this comes from. If you didn't go looking for it, don't install it. Have intention, very Buddhist, to install software if that's what you want to do. And then, once you bought it, you own it. So if you installed it, keep that software updated. Remember, we were talking about the software development process potentially has bugs in it, right? You potentially have errors found in software. Even with the best intentions and the best programmers, things can happen. So if you installed something, make sure to keep it updated. And most software now that you download and use on a larger scale has an update mechanism. What that mechanism is depends on the software, so it's hard to say exactly, but usually it's somewhere under the about or something like that. You'll have an option to check for updates. Definitely do that from time to time. If you need to make a schedule, make a schedule. But I would say, if you have so much software that you have to keep a written schedule about updating it, consider whether you still need that. Which brings us to the 3rd rule, which is if you no longer need that software, uninstall it. And I know I'm guilty of this both on my system and on my computer system and on my phone. You use that parking app on your phone one time while you were traveling, just to make things easier, and then you came back home and you haven't used it in the last 2 years. How many people do you need? How often do you need to access the Kansas City parking meter app? But I don't need it anymore, so I should get rid of it, right? Likewise, from time to time, you'll install things on your computer system that you needed, perhaps for work, perhaps you needed to do some sort of video conferencing that you don't normally use. You install the software, great, you used it, but if you're not going to use it again, go ahead and uninstall it. It saves you disk space and decreases the attack surface that an attacker could use to get into your system. Thirdly, let's talk about antivirus and anti-malware. So antivirus and anti-malware are not your first line of defense. Is that surprising? Well, hopefully it isn't, but if it is, consider this. You are the best defense for your computer system, and you and everyone else who uses it, depending on how many people you have in your house, but you're the best defense, right? The antivirus and anti-malware is going to try to catch things that got past you, right? So if you're being careful about what apps you install, you're using a low privileged user, right, a standard user for your day to day, and you're keeping everything updated, then the antivirus is going to catch the things that are actually really tricky, or that aren't what they say they are, or aren't what they seem to be, right? So antivirus and anti-malware aren't perfect. They do, because of their nature, have to be very closely tied to the operating system. And if you want them to scan your files, they have to be able to access your files. So consider, as you use your system, that it does also create a little bit of extra load as far as file access and memory usage, and all of those things can in fact impact your system, especially if you have an older system. So be cognizant of that. And it's a good reason for what I'm about to say now. You don't need to have every antivirus program under the sun running on your system, right? So if you've got Windows and you've got a Windows 10 that's currently updated, Windows Defender does a pretty good job, right? You could stick with that. If you don't like Windows Defender for whatever reason, you could run something like Clam Antivirus. It is an open source and pretty highly rated system. It does a pretty good job, but no antivirus system is perfect, right? So what antivirus systems do is they attempt to catch something before it's installed or before it can execute any sort of malicious payload, right? The other thing you have is anti-malware, and I'm just going to throw out Malwarebytes here because it's probably the most popular. It does have a free version, but what anti-malware attempts to do is to catch stuff that has anything that's been installed, and it looks for particular signature patterns of usage, right? It can do a little bit more deep scanning, but it's also a little bit more intensive. But if you were to do a defense in-depth multi-tiered approach, I would go with whatever antivirus you like. If that's Windows Defender, then that's perfectly fine. And then add Malwarebytes to periodically scan beyond that. And that will give you a pretty good defense in depth. And that coupled with good browsing habits and good security, will keep you generally safe, right? What is good security? Well, let's talk about good security for a moment. One of the most important things you can do, both, and this is now we're moving into not just your system at home or any of your systems at home, but also into your use of online services, right? Pretty much everyone today, or all over the place today, every time you do something, someone wants you to create an account. You want to order from Grubhub? Hey, why don't you create an account? If you order from something like Amazon, of course, you're creating an account. If you're using Google services, you create another account. If you, want to buy from 1-800-Flowers, account. Everything gets an account now, right? So we have to memorize a lot of passwords. And there are good passwords and there are bad passwords. And all of them probably can be best done with a password manager. So just so you know, the average person uses 3 to 4 to 5 passwords, and see if this is you, either uses the same passwords over and over because they remember them, or sometimes, and this was previous advice years and years ago, adds like a prefix or a suffix, and such as password, and perhaps it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Perhaps the next one is password 4, 5, 6, 7, something like that. Those are terrible examples of passwords to use, but you see where I'm going, right? So those, even those become tricky to remember. So we've spent years trying to come up with ways for people to generate their own passwords. And what we're finally at the point now, honestly, where most cybersecurity professionals realize that people are terrible at generating passwords. I'm terrible at generating passwords, and I do this for a living, right? So, what makes an insufficient password? Well, let's take a look at the top 15 passwords over the last decade, right? Do you see any trends here? So, Splash Data is a company that collects these. They collect them out of password dumps which are passwords that are pulled from systems that are breached and then dropped online to for other users to add to their password list when they try password cracking. But I'll submit to you that most of the passwords you see in here don't require a lot of work. All right? The top 2 passwords since 2011 are either password, which is obvious, or 123456, which arguably is just as obvious. What do we look like in 2020? Not sure yet, but it will be interesting to see. I will predict that 123456 will somehow still be back on the top of the list. So, if any of you see your passwords in here, then consider that everyone knows, right? And it's only a matter of time before someone tries these with your account data, right? But what makes these bad passwords? In and of themselves, why are these not good passwords? Well, let's talk about that real quick. What makes a password a weak password, right? So many of them are default passwords. If you have a device or a system that comes with an administrator password, and you log in with defaults, a lot of routers are like this. If you're using home Wi-Fi routers and things like that, there's a default password and username, right? Obviously, those are terrible passwords, not because the passwords themselves are bad, but because they're potentially, you could Google them and compromise them. Dictionary words in any language, why are those a bad idea? Well, because any dictionary word could be pulled out of a dictionary and fed into an attack system, and that attack system could try those dictionary words a lot faster than you could. Likewise, just appending numbers or characters or putting something into leet speak, which is altering slightly, like for example, making an E into a 3, any of that is still relatively predictable because it follows a certain rule. Concatenation is the same thing. It's just jamming a couple words together, but those are still the same words. You see where I'm going with this, right? Common keyboard sequences, let's not forget, probably your most common possible keyboard sequence would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we also see from time to time things like QWERTY, which if you look at your keyboard right now, you see where that is, but you already knew that, didn't you? Right? And then other sequences like 1Q, 2W, 3E, 4R, you get the idea. All those are right there in front of you on your keyboard, and as such, they're predictable. And the dictionary words with simple obfuscation, sort of the same thing. Intentional misspellings, all of that, right? And some of the other ones that used to be actually recommended, but I definitely don't recommend them anymore, are personal identifiers, right? There was a time when a number of people I knew used something like their birth date as a PIN code, right? 2-digit year, 2-digit day, 2-digit month. Boom, there's your PIN code, right? The problem is, with the advent of social media, and remember how I said early on in the discussion, it's really easy to find your personal information, that level of personal information at this point. If you've ever posted it online, even if you've later thought better of it, it's still probably out there, right? So let's talk a little bit about how passwords get broken, right? Sarah Palin, exactly that. She had used some of her personal information, not in her password itself, as far as we know, but in her password reset. So if you've got your password reset questions, and they're all based on publicly available information, then anyone who has that information could potentially reset that information. Social engineering is something I'm not going to talk that much about today, but it is the number one way to get information out of someone. If you'd like to Google Matt Honan, I definitely welcome you to do that. There's a very interesting video put out by a good friend of ours, Chris Hadnagy, who runs the social engineering village at DEF CON, and he demonstrates with one of his associates how easy it is to social engineer information out of someone. It's a great watch, and it's not that long. And then, of course, you have dictionary attacks, which, just like it sounds, runs a dictionary of words or a list of words at a password to see if they can crack the password that way, followed by what we call brute force attacks, which take the absolute longest time. But if they're allowed to execute to the completion, they will eventually guess the password. But they really run through every possible combination of passwords starting from 000001 to ZZZZZ or whatever. Right? So you can get from this that we need to make good passwords, right? So good passwords consist of a long password, a complex password, and an unpredictable password. Three things that us as human beings don't appreciate. We don't appreciate long strings of complex, unpredictable gibberish. It's impossible to remember, honestly, for most of us. And the most important of these is length. Here, for example, if you had an 8-character password, right, with all possible combinations of lowercase letters, just the lowercase to keep the math simple, you would have just over 208 billion possibilities. If you use 30 characters, and 30 of just lowercase characters, then it becomes a ginormous number. And even a computer will get tired of doing these, right? Keep in mind that there's no perfect security, but what you've done by having a 30-character password in this case is made it impractical for anyone to try to break this, right? It would take a really long time, by which time that hacker or whoever is trying to get into your system is going to give up and go find that more vulnerable target, right? When we talk about complexity, it needs to be unpredictable. And just like we said, things that are predictable are passwords that are in the common password list. They're not a dictionary word or anything else that could be loaded into a computer. They're not the same one that you use on 4 different websites. They're not based on your personal identifiers, and they're not common, any sort of common phrase. Bible, song lyrics, all those things can be loaded into a password cracker and run at a potential password, right? Awesome. And how many passwords could it guess? What would make you want to write this down? If you want to test any of this and just see how secure a password is, you can check this site. But I will say this, don't put any of your actual passwords in there, because I wouldn't put any of your actual passwords in there. Not because I distrust howsecureismypassword.net, but because it's a poor choice to start putting your actual in-use passwords to the test out on the internet. Use this as more of an opportunity to play with the weak or strong algorithm and see if that is in fact workable, right? So, as an example, are these weak or strong passwords? Well, I'll let you think about that. I will say that both of them are somewhat predictable, although the one on the bottom is significantly more predictable. Bruce Willis is, or at least was, a fairly popular actor, is a pretty well-known name, and it's a human read, and that is the sort of thing that could potentially be in a lot of lists. Rocks, common phrase or a common word, and then, frankly, the last couple characters are trivial to guess those, right? On the top, you have something that looks a lot more like LeetSpeak, but LeetSpeak follows certain rules and conventions. So, believe it or not, it's even though it appears more complex, it's actually slightly shorter, and it's also potentially easily guessed by a computer that does a controlled substitution, right? So how do you deal with that? I recommend a password manager. A lot of people do. I don't recommend this guy's password manager, although I feel bad for him, because while it is true that that would not be remotely hackable, it is unfortunate that it made it into this picture. Also, it's fraught with peril. There are lots of different ways that password could go wrong. One of the things that you could and should do is use a password manager. This kind of password manager, right? A password manager that has strong encryption, that's designed for passwords or other account data, in that it saves things like, hey, this username goes with that password, and that sort of thing. And most good password managers right now can also incorporate the URL or web address of the site that they're unlocking, so they can verify that in fact the site that you're on is the site that you intend to go to, which prevents or helps prevent things like man-in-the-middle attacks, right? So password managers can be either host-based or cloud-based, and we'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. But all password managers have certain benefits, right? They allow you to have very long, complex, and unpredictable passwords. The second thing they do is allow you to use different passwords for everything. Even if we used our friend in Hawaii's mechanism here to do password management, we would quickly run into the problem that we'd run out of Post-its, right? For all the different accounts that we need to log into, pretty soon our whole monitor would be crazy with Post-its. So they allow us to use different passwords on everything. And hey, if we can use a different password, why not use a different username? For as many places as ask you or suggest that you use your email as a username, that's half of your password combination, right? Your username and password. If you don't have to use your email, which is a common attack vector, then don't. Use an actual username. And you could use a different one if you had a password manager, which would help you keep track of that, right? So, awesome. It will also help you to change passwords and usernames without forgetting to do it. Most of them, you can set them to remind you to periodically change them if that's something you want to do. Or a lot of times, if you know that they'll keep track of things like, hey, there was a breach at xyz.com. I see you have a password there. Recommend you change your password and generate a new one. Right? Even though for you, because you're using your password manager and a unique password on each site, that's not going to be as much of a vulnerability as Bob at bob.com, who uses his email and 123456 as a password on every site that he uses. Right? Awesome. So we said there are two kinds, right? There's a host-based. The host-based password manager is a password manager that resides on your local system. That local system saves them as a file. It's encrypted, of course, which makes it somewhat portable. You can move that between systems, but you would have to develop your own process for that. And it's more secure than a cloud-based in the sense that you are responsible for your own security. Now, if you're not that great with security, perhaps it's not. But nonetheless, the responsibility and the trust that you have is based on your own actions, right? So you know that you can trust yourself, and so you'll do the best you can with that. There's also no risk in transit. If you're using a cloud-based system, then of course your passwords or an encrypted version of your password database is going to be sent across the internet, where it is potentially vulnerable to loss or destruction or compromise. The downside to a host-based password manager is if you mistakenly delete that file, then you've lost your passwords. The only backups you make are the ones you make yourself. So if your password manager is stored on a particular hard drive, it's where you always store it, and that hard drive crashes, Now you've lost access to your password manager, and you've potentially lost all of the passwords that you had stored in it. So that's a downside to host-based password management. The other thing is version control problems. I know very few people who use who use only one electronic device. I've got a cell phone, I've got a laptop, I've got a desktop. I frequently end up using a second laptop, and all of those I use passwords on, right? So for me, it becomes tricky making sure that the host-based password database that I'm using is the most current one, and that moves around from system to system along with me. It's an additional step. So you have that as version control. We've all done it. It's just like saving a file, right? So I make edits on one computer. I go to do something on another one. I edit it again. Then I go to save, and I save over the initial edits that I made on the other computer because I forgot that I hadn't copied it over. The exact same thing can happen with a password manager. Although, quite honestly, I'm sure that many of you are better than me at this. The other option then that you have is cloud-based password management, which is designed to be totally portable. Your password database is saved in the cloud from hosted by whatever service you decide to use, and there are a lot of them out there. So it's totally portable, right? It's accessible from multiple devices. For example, if you use something like Bitwarden, as an example, it's an open source central system. I can install a client on my Android phone, on my iPad. I can install a client on my MacBook and on my PC. All three of those different operating systems and devices, or four of them, can pull the data from the cloud. The data is the same for all of it, and I can access my passwords in more or less real time and keep them all up to date in real time. Also, if any or all of those devices end up breaking or getting lost, stolen, what have you, my password database is still securely stored in the cloud. And as soon as I get a new device, I can or should be able to put a new client on there, log back in, and boom, I have my passwords and my password database restored to me. So it makes it very good for both version control and to prevent the loss or destruction of that password database. On the flip side, you're now offloading that trust to a third party who you're relying on to store that data and to protect it. Remember, we talked about that security piece right up front, right? You're now trusting that cloud-based provider that they will properly secure your data, and that they'll be able to handle potential attacks from hackers who are definitely interested in breaching a password database company. Imagine what a target that is for a hacker. If you could actually get into a password database company, it would give you all of the difficult passwords that you haven't been able to crack from all the other places, right? With all the user data. So that is a higher potential risk of exposure. So you'll have to weigh that. Also, while they should be private on the system, keep in mind that you're also trusting that cloud-based provider doesn't have access to your password data, the websites that you're using, etc. Imagine that your cloud-based provider, again, this goes into the security privacy thing. Sure, it's all secure, but what if they decided in their terms of service that they could sell not your passwords or user data, but just the websites that you saved to kind of give a broad view of your interests, right? That would be a potential privacy exposure. So you'll have to weigh those two things against choosing which cloud-based provider you would want to go with, or whether you would go with one at all, right? So here we are on the internet. We've got secure passwords. How do we mostly interact with the internet? Well, we use a web browser, right? You're probably using a web browser right now to watch this. In fact, even if you're using the YouTube app, you're probably basically using a web browser, right? The YouTube app uses a very similar process to a web browser, even though it does limit certain things, right? So consider it the front door to your computer, right? It has all sorts of elements that deal with your system security. And when we talk about attribution, that's kind of going into the privacy thing, right? It allows the website that you're communicating with to know some things about you, right? For example, which web browser you're using, what your operating system is, what your screen size is. All of those things get passed, amongst many others, to any web server you can connect to. Likewise, when the web server sends information back, it's your browser that collects it and then puts it together to present a website to you. So there's not a different, under modern web sites, there's not a different site, generally speaking, anymore for a mobile versus a laptop style website. The site actually adjusts to whatever your screen size is, whatever sort of aspect you're looking at, that sort of thing. So your browser is in charge of controlling that presentation. It's actually executing code on your system that was sent to it from the web server, and that code determines how that information is being presented to you. It can also be used to track you. So consider that when you're considering your web browsing experience. I'll be honest, I would stick with Firefox. So, truth in lending, there are a lot of times when I use Chrome. There are a lot of times when I use Edge, and they're often because of the sites that I'm visiting. It's often internal to companies that require a certain type, of browser to connect with. So if you're, for example, working for an entity that still requires you to use Internet Explorer, I get it. You still got to have it. It's too bad, but there you go. But for day-to-day browsing the web in general, I really recommend Firefox. It's free, number one. It's fast, and it's designed to be secure for you. It also has a very, we'll call it granular control. It gives you a lot of specifics in controlling how your web browsing experience plays out, right? You can go in and you can set a lot of those things. So that gives you the ability to control your web experience and turn off the things that you may not want it to do. Also, Firefox has some really good plugins. A shout out to NoScript that can completely disable things like JavaScript. And perhaps that will be a talk for another time. Right? But it's definitely worth looking at. If you haven't tried Firefox, give it a shot. So while all that data is flying around the internet, here's a couple things to think about. Right? Every communication that you have across the internet, it breaks down the information that you're using into packets, and then it sends it across the internet. And those packets take whatever the shortest route, and that's logical route, not necessarily physical route, is to reach their destination. They try to do it as efficiently as possible. So that's using, and we'll talk about transport layer security and private networks in here. Consider that when you're using something like, just on the internet in general, all those packets are being sent through different systems that belong to different people, right? Perhaps even surfing, going to Amazon, as an example, you're going to leave your home system. If you're using Wi-Fi or something in a spot like Starbucks, then you're going to go through their system. That's going to go out to their internet service provider. Let's call it Comcast in this case. It's going to go through Comcast's system. It's going to go through whoever the backbone provider is. Let's say it's L3, who knows, right? Goes to the backbone provider, goes to whichever data center Amazon routes you to based on Amazon's own quality of service algorithms, and boom, there you end up in Amazon system. And there could be a lot more in there too. If you are overseas, you're going to go through other systems. If you're on the cell service, if you're using cellular data like LTE, you're going to go through additional systems there. And all of them, potentially, your data as it transits those systems is potentially vulnerable to inspection or exploitation, right? So let's talk real quick about Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi adds an additional layer of insecurity or additional potential insecure layer because it's a broadcast medium. When you connect via Wi-Fi, you're broadcasting that signal in every different direction, right? 360 degrees. So anyone, not just between you and your access point, but anyone around you could potentially listen in. And yes, if you don't have a secured Wi-Fi, then someone could definitely be listening in, right? And that's where you get into things like man-in-the-middle attacks. And if you want to see just how easy those are, quick shout out to my friends at Hack5. They put out things like the Wi-Fi Pineapple for penetration testers to demonstrate just how easy it is to be able to get in between these Wi-Fi signals or get into the Wi-Fi signals, right? Yes, you can protect the data security of your web browsing session by using HTTPS, right? We're all familiar with a little padlock that shows up at the top of our browser, and that's good. That is a good start. However, you are still not protecting a number of privacy issues related to your computer's hardware, your actual IP address, and things like that. So, even though it is an absolute necessity to use HTTPS while using either Wi-Fi, especially Wi-Fi, but even a regular wired connection, the next best thing, and especially while you're traveling, is to use a virtual private network. All right? So, what is a VPN? I think most of us have become more familiar with them now that we've all worked from home, more or less for the last year or so. But let's talk about what you've got going on, right? So, your internet traffic is available to various parties online. Think of every packet of data that you send across the internet has a from address and a to address, just like you would have if you were sending a box through the mail or through UPS or something like that, right? You have to have a from and to address, otherwise two-way communication cannot occur, right? However, for privacy concerns, and depending on what you're doing, possibly even security concerns, you might not want those headers, those addresses, to be available to everyone, right? And even if you're using HTTPS, think of HTTPS as the information that's locked inside that package. But the outer package is still visible because it has to be, to a degree, for the internet to function. What a virtual private network allows you to do is to run your traffic to a service provider, and then from that service provider out into the internet. When it comes out of the service provider's exit point, it looks like it's coming from that point, wherever that is, perhaps at a major server center like New Jersey, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, etc. And it doesn't necessarily lead back to you, the individual sitting in your garage, giving a talk on YouTube, right? So, and the sites that you visit will see you as coming from that location rather than from your home location. And if that's important to you, then that's good to know, all right? And that's what you want to do. It also encrypts that information along the path so that even if you're using, and this happens a lot now, a Wi-Fi in a hotel that doesn't have it's not password protected and therefore not encrypted, it will still have that. It will still put that communication in an encrypted packet that will go between you and your VPN service provider, so that the people who are hanging out and listening with this equipment that you can easily buy, they're not going to be able to see what you're doing online. They're not going to be able to see where you're going or who you're talking to. Right on. So, there are a couple downsides to VPNs. They obviously are going to know where you're coming from, and where you're going, because they're going to have to route that traffic through their system. They're going to know when you are connecting. They're going to know generally the volume of the packets, which is the amount of data that you're using. And they're going to, depending on what your package contents are, they may have access to that. Now, if you're using HTTPS, they won't have access to your web browsing data because that's encrypted on a different level between you and the website, right? Ideally, you wouldn't want them logging any of these things. But I'll be honest, in the real world, even the VPNs that don't excuse me, log your data and retain it, do log it temporarily for troubleshooting and other issues, right? So just understand that your VPN provider, you're putting some trust in them that they're keeping your information secure. Which then brings up the question, how would you choose a VPN provider? I'm glad you asked that. Here's what I would recommend without going into excruciating detail. I would go to safetydetectives.com/bestvpns. This is a site that was formerly called That One Privacy Site, and they have ratings for over 150 different VPN services. Now, they focus on privacy, so they talk about jurisdiction, logging, activism. They go into depth about technical server configurations, security, availability, etc. And then, of course, the business side, their pricing, how easy it is to sign up, and then any other concerns that may or may not have been brought up. The only thing I would say about this site, which is fantastic and very up to date, is that they're very privacy concerned. So they rate sites that have endpoints inside the United States as lower because we have weaker privacy laws here than in various other places in the world. But if that isn't one of your concerns, then perhaps that's fine with you. When I'm traveling out of the country and I just want to log in to check my bank account or pay bills or whatever, I'm absolutely fine with having a VPN that exits in the US because that's where I'm calling back to anyway. And that's not in my threat model, right? All right, there is one other thing we could do. Now, if you find yourself in a position where you have zero trust, which is a new word or a new phrase that we're going to be seeing coming out a lot in the next couple years, you have zero trust in VPNs. You just can't trust someone else with your data. You could try the Onion router. The Tor network, real briefly, was developed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the U.S. Naval Research Labs all the way back in the 90s, right? So they initially launched it in 2002 and then released the product to the open source software community in 2004. This was run by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a foundation that is really focused on making sure that people's privacy and information is protected on the internet, as well as your freedom to use the internet without regulation, right? But in 2006, they spun off the Tor project into a 501c foundation, which is a charitable foundation, a nonprofit, I should say, in the public interest, right? So the Tor project's actually been around for a really long time, and it operates like a VPN, but also not. What happens is, very simply, is that the Tor routes your traffic securely through 3 hops and then back out to the internet. These hops are volunteer computers who are running the Tor client themselves, and it routes it all over the world, really. The reason this works is that no client, no one in the Tor network knows anything other than who they're connected to and who they're passing traffic to with the website that you're connected to. And that is Tor in a nutshell. Now, Tor also has what we call hidden services. And those are actually Tor services hidden inside that are connected by another 3 hops and that never go back out to the internet. But that I'm going to leave you with as kind of a hook to come and see, come and hear other talks that we give about the dark web and the Tor network. So, I'm looking through. I don't see that there are any questions just yet. So, that wraps it up. I ran a little bit long today, but I understand that there were some glitches up front getting connected to the link. I apologize for that. But on the plus side, now that you have the link, you can always go back and watch it. All right. Any questions out there regarding anything that we covered today? And man, let me tell you, trying to squeeze this into an hour is very difficult. There's a whole range of other things we could talk about. And if you want to contact us for more information at blackhorsesolutions.com, I'm sure that will be somewhere on the screen for you to click on. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then I want to thank you very much for coming out on a lovely Saturday afternoon. It was great having everyone here, and I hope that we see you again in the future, possibly at one of our classes where we can put some of this to practice. All right. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time that we have a talk like this. Thanks, everyone.